Good afternoon, dear Love Life.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar organized by the FTTH Council Europe. I'm Vincent Garnier, the Director General of the Council, and with me I have the pleasure to welcome Benoît Felten of Plum Consulting. Benoît is the main speaker for the event today. I will just start with a few housekeeping items and introduction before I give the floor to Benoît. We have a great tech-up for this session. So I guess the introduction will give some time for the rest of the audience to join us. But yes, Benoît, if you could bring us to the next slide, I will say as an introduction a few words about the FTTH Council. We are an industry association, non-profit organization with the objective to promote a full fiber network as the most future-proof and sustainable access network technology. Our activity is around publishing reports, educating the entire ecosystem, influencing policymakers, and also organizing events, some of them physical, like the FTTH conference, which will take place very soon in Madrid, where the entire industry can meet network. If you bring us to the next slide, Benoît, I will just explain that this event is part of a series of webinars we are organizing more or less on a monthly basis. And we try to offer to our audience, best insight about technology, about market drivers. And these are promoted as thought leadership content. A few practical information on the next slide. This webinar will be recorded, so the replay is accessible and will be sent to all registrants after this session, together with a link to the main asset that we are describing today in Benoît's presentation. If you want to ask question, please use the question box that you will see on your control panel. You can type the question. We have reserved time at the end of this webinar for Benoît to address any of your questions. If we cannot cover all of them, we will certainly follow up after this session. So with that, I have the pleasure to officially welcome again Benoît Felten, Director at Plum Consulting. And just to give you a brief overview of what you can expect from this webinar. At the FTTH Council, we're monitoring the evolution of FTTH rollout throughout Europe. We see that now we have passed the 50% threshold in terms of coverage. But at the same time, we also notice that the take-up is still around 50%, which means that although one in two households in Europe has potentially access to fiber, only a quarter of the population is effectively connected to the internet on the basis of full fiber networks. Understanding the dynamic, the driver and the hurdles around the take-up and how demand can be better increased is really the objective of the study that we have asked Plum to undertake. So with that, I will leave the floor to Benoît, who will re-explain the content of the study and deliver the key takeaway from that very important work.
Thank you, Vincent. Hello, everyone. I will just very briefly tell you who I am and who Plum Consulting is before going straight into the content. So I'm Benoît Felten. I've been working in fiber to the home related topics for close to 2 decades now. I have joined last year Plum Consulting, which is a boutique consulting firm based in London and Paris. Our key focus areas revolve around the economics of network infrastructure, radio spectrum and its economic value and technical efficiencies. More and more we work around digital platforms, the ecosystem, the value chain of digital platforms and their impact on regulation. And of course, there are a lot of other topics, but I think that covers the main things that you might be interested in today. Indeed, when we were initially contacted and commissioned by the council to do this study, we first looked at what we would call the potential for subscriber growth in the fiber to home arena in Europe. Clearly, the shift to VHCN in European policy has had a very strong and measurable impact on deployment. But the fact is that take-up hasn't always followed suit. And right now, take-up at a European scale is around 50% of homes passed, which brings it around 25, a little above 25% of potential subscribers. So that means that half of that could be addressed today with existing already deployed networks, and twice that could be addressed through further deployments. So it was important for us to understand what drove take-up and what could be done to accelerate that growth. So the study was structured into 4 streams of work that were consecutive. And one of the key objectives in the early phases was to try and understand why certain countries at equivalent level of deployment had much better take-up than others. Or to put it another way, why some countries were lagging behind. So what we did for this was, first of all, we did a high-level quantitative analysis across the entire EU footprint plus UK, and we tried to identify key drivers for fiber adoption. Then, as a second phase, we drilled down into 8 specific countries that we felt highlighted particularly interesting drivers or hurdles. We also analyzed existing demand-side policies. There are not that many in Europe, but we felt it was necessary to look into how effective they had been. And on the basis of all of this, we made some conclusions and recommendations on what policies could be that could make a difference. Before we start to describe the results, we felt it would be interesting to have some feedback from you, the audience, on how important you think this issue of adoption is. So we have a little poll that's going to show up on your side. Please answer the poll. It'll take a minute, and then we can briefly discuss the results.
Yeah, thank you, Benoît. And while I see that many of our attendees are voting, we give everyone a few seconds. So for option, from your industry perspective, how much of an issue is adoption of FTTH? Not an issue at all, a minor issue, a major issue, or a vital issue that could endanger the industry. So there seems to be now a clear profile which is being defined. I give maybe 3-4 seconds before we share the results. Yeah, I think we can go live now. It will not change too much. So let me share the result. Not issue at all, 8%. A minor issue, 17%. A major issue, the vast majority of the audience, 61%, and 14% think this is a vital issue. So maybe a few comments from your side, Benoît, before we move to the rest of your deck.
Well, I mean, this means that basically 75% of people who are with us today think this is a very important issue. And we think so too. And this kind of validates or justifies the fact that we've spent this time and effort to find some answers to this. So let me now delve into what these answers might be. So I'm not going to go in a great level of depth here. This is more for future reference, but essentially we analyzed 3 types of data points at the EU plus UK level socioeconomic factors such as income levels, income distribution, poverty rates, GDP, etc. Digital supply factors, broadband prices, quality of existing copper networks, broadband speeds, and digital demand factors such as digital literacy, consumer equipment ownership, and broadband usage levels. The constraint that we had was that we had to have data that was consistent across the entire footprint, and we also had to have data that was publicly available. So there are a few indicators that we wished we could have found, but we weren't able to find. But nonetheless, this led us to a number of really interesting conclusions. So the first one is that there clearly seems to be a symbiotic relationship between the speed of deployment and the speed of take-up. The kind of common thinking about this is that deployment drives take-up, because obviously if you don't deploy, you cannot have adoption. But looking at the data, we felt that the causality was a little harder to establish. And it is likely that in some instances, a high initial take-up on an initial deployment actually accelerates further deployment, because it becomes easier for network operators to find funding. They also generate more cash flow much faster. So really, it's both of these are feeding into each other. And there seems to be a kind of virtuous circle that once it's in motion, actually really boosts adoption. The second aspect, which is not a surprise, but it's, I think, important to have it kind of restated, is that the price gap between fiber to the home prices and legacy broadband prices, particularly ADSL and FTTC, that price gap can be a hurdle if it's too important. So clearly, the higher that price gap and the lower the take-up. Again, not surprising, price sensitivity, but it's important to reiterate because it means that anyone who is in the business of selling their deployed fiber needs to take that into account. Another hurdle, which is not so prevalent, but is still worth thinking about and worth mentioning, is that if there is a high price difference between fiber to the home and mobile broadband, that seems to be a hurdle as well. So in other words, a high price difference between fiber to the home and mobile broadband likely drives some customers to prefer mobile broadband and basically disregard fixed broadband entirely. So that's worth keeping in mind. And finally, an interesting finding in the sense that we didn't find anything is that we didn't find any strong correlation between socioeconomic indicators and fiber adoption. In other words, things like income levels and income distribution, rural versus urban population, this kind of thing did not seem to have a measurable impact on take-up. One particular aspect here, which did surprise us, but we think now that we kind of understand why that is the case, is that we couldn't find a correlation between digital literacy and fiber to home adoption. And we think that the reason for this is that if there is a correlation, it's a correlation between broadband in general and digital literacy. But there is no indication that an increase in digital literacy would immediately boost fiber as opposed to any other access means to the internet or broadband in general. So that was the kind of information that we could gather from this high-level macro analysis. Clearly, this didn't go deep enough for our expectations, and we decided to do a more qualitative analysis on 8 countries. Some countries where we knew the take-up was very high compared to the average. some countries where we knew that it was lower than average, and the idea was to try and understand the reasons for all of this. So the countries that we looked at were Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, Sweden, and the UK. And this has allowed us to identify a set of drivers and hurdles and build a conceptual framework, which I am going to share with you in a minute. Some of these drivers and hurdles are in the hands of the market and the market players. In other words, it is things that the market players need to do to accelerate adoption. Others are in the hands of policymakers and governments. So this leads us to a second poll question that we wanted to share with you before we move on, which is more about where do you think the onus of improving take-up might lie?
Yeah, Benoît, and the question indeed is, which of the following do you think is the number one reason to explain FTTH adoption issue where they exist? So 4 answers: A, service provider not doing a good job; B, government non-implementing policies to facilitate adoption; the third option is consumer who don't want FTTH; and the final one is the reliance of mobile, which makes fixed broadband less attractive. So service provider, government, consumer, or mobile being the main reason for difficulty around FTTH adoption. So I'm giving a few seconds for our audience to vote. This is much more balanced than what we had in the previous question, I must tell you, Benoît. So I might give another few seconds to make sure that we capture accurately the sentiment from our audience today. I'll close the poll and share. And actually, we see 32% thinking that service provider somehow are to blame for that. Government follows closely with 26%. 18% of the audience thinks that the main reason comes from consumer not wanting FTTH, and 24% that the mobile aspect is really impacting that element of adoption. So quite balanced between those 4 possibilities, Benoît.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting here is that this actually gels in with some of the findings that we're going to share. One might say that to a certain extent, consumers not wanting FTTH and mobile are still market elements in the sense that it's up to service providers to convince consumers that they need FTTH, and it's also up to them to be able to compete effectively with mobile. But that still leaves a quarter of respondents who think that government policy could make a difference. We happen to think that it's maybe a bit more of a strong lever than that, but I will share the results of the second phase of the study now so we can highlight this. All right, so this is the conceptual framework that we built. The idea here was to basically capture all of the main hurdles and drivers, but also to allocate them to either the market or the policymakers. I'm not going to go through all of these in great depth, and in the study you will see that this conceptual framework is applied to all 8 countries, so you can really see in each country which hurdles and drivers have been key in getting the market to where it is today. But I'm going to talk about kind of groupings of these more generally. So the first hurdles that we see on the market side is the whole aspect of actually connecting the customer to the network. So this takes essentially two sides. One side is related to the physical connection of the network, in a lot of markets, especially in markets where there's a lot of single home ownership. There is some resistance to people coming in, drilling through your wall, etc. It really depends on what the nature of the real estate is. And some countries have kind of addressed this preemptively. Others are really struggling with this. And the second one, of course, is that sometimes service providers charge for connection. And that also creates a lot of resistance. Of course, there are costs to connecting a new customer. So sometimes this is more insidious. So even if the end user doesn't have to pay to connect, well, the service providers have to. So for example, as an illustration of the first point, the UK is a market where there's a lot of challenge around getting into the homes, a lot of resistance. Italy is a country where switching fees have been a problem because the wholesale service providers that are on Telecom Italia's network for FTTC are reluctant to pay switching fees to get onto Open Fiber's FTTH network, even though this would be transparent from the customer's point of view. But just having to replace a CPE is a form of switching fee. The second category of hurdles and drivers are related to two things. The first is really the policy and industry choices that were made 10 years ago when it comes to whether to go down the fiber to the cabinet route or to go down the fiber to the home route, are kind of haunting the markets that went for FTTC, because it is much harder for service providers to differentiate an FTTH offer when FTTC delivers decent broadband. It is much easier to do that in markets where the alternative is ADSL, because the gap is so much wider. So this is something we see in Germany, in the UK, in Italy, and to a certain extent in Denmark. The legacy technology choices or networks are creating a kind of slowdown of take-up. And even in Denmark, where the take-up is quite high, we see that in urban areas where cable is present, the take-up is much lower. Content availability. Now, this one is tricky because, first of all, it may be going away to a certain extent. So we think that it still is important in a few markets, but it clearly is less important than it was a few years ago. Basically, this is about who owns gated content. But as more and more of the content, especially video content, moves to online, universally accessible subscriptions, this is starting to disappear. We can still see a level of that with Sky in the UK and with certain cable providers in various other markets. But we think that while this was an important factor, it is increasingly not so important. The third angle is pricing and product differentiation. So this is something that is reconfirmed from our first phase. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but obviously prices for fiber need to be aggressive compared to legacy solutions. Otherwise, it's very hard to create drivers. But we also see that price is not enough, and product differentiation weighs a lot in there as well. And typically, one of the things that we believe may be a market side issue is that a lot of service providers are still focused on offering a lot of different packages over fiber, starting at speeds that are very comparable to what might be found elsewhere. And this kind of dilutes the differentiation of fiber compared to FTTC or cable. Now, I mentioned previously that we couldn't find a data correlation between digital literacy and fiber adoption. Now, that doesn't mean that in some markets we don't believe that digital literacy is a hurdle, as is low income. And two countries in particular from our sample, Poland, where there's still a significant portion of the country that is not on the internet at all, entirely. And this is very much tied to rural areas, low income, digital literacy. And also Italy, where a significant portion of the country is on legacy ADSL and does not seem to be easily motivated to move to faster broadband speeds. And again, in the analysis that we managed to do, this was very much tied to people not understanding how all of this works, and therefore concerned that any change is going to create complications. So not universal, but in certain specific countries, an important aspect. Now, these two aspects are very much about awareness of brands. They're very different, but they actually act on the same lever. So what we see in markets where a lot of the fiber products are available through wholesale, markets like Italy or the UK right now, what we see in these markets is that the absence of national recognized brands on the fiber platform, or at least the lesser weight of these brands on the fiber platform, actually slows down adoption, because a lot of consumers would prefer to stay with the trusted, recognized national brand that they already know. Similarly, in some countries, and this is particularly the case in the UK again, in some countries, fiber advertising was not properly regulated, and basically anyone who was selling any broadband solution that had even a tiny bit of fiber in it could call it fiber. And this has effectively spoiled the fiber terminology from a marketing point of view, which makes it harder for full fiber providers to actually highlight the differences that this contributes. As an anecdote, we heard from a number of service providers in the UK, for example, that when they call FTTC customers to offer a switch to fiber, these customers will tell them that they already have fiber. So the level of misunderstanding is quite high. Now, I've singled out network competition because it's both a very important component and also one that is kind of evolving in interesting ways. So if we look at markets where the fiber to home take-up is the highest, a number of these markets have strong network competition. So multiple service providers competing to serve the same customers. Sorry, multiple network operators competing to serve the same customers. So this is obviously true in Spain. To a large extent, it's true in France as well, at least in a significant portion of the population coverage. And there's no doubt that that dynamic was very positive in terms of driving adoption. Now, what's interesting though is that as these markets mature, and we see this particularly in Spain, we see that there's a gradual shift from network competition to a wholesale model, where now in the Spanish market, most operators actually would rather go on someone else's network than deploy their own. And these are purely commercial basis deals. So it's interesting, and we do think network competition is a driver, but we also think that it is not necessarily the only model that can drive adoption. And you know, the kind of flip side of that is looking at Sweden or Denmark, where network competition historically was limited. It's increasing a little bit now, in Denmark at least. But we see that it's not the only driver, but it certainly is an important driver. Now, these two are connected to the legacy copper network for the most part. Now, I'm going to start with the bottom one, which is firmly in the hands of policy, which is the ability to switch the copper network off. Now, obviously, this driver only applies once fiber penetration and fiber adoption has gotten to a stage where it is envisageable to actually move forward with copper switch off. We're seeing this now in Spain, in France, in Sweden, and other countries have plans, even though it's probably a bit too early for them to execute on those plans. Now, obviously, once consumers are told that the copper network will no longer exist down the line, that creates a very strong incentive for them to migrate. But interestingly, what we're also suspecting rather than seeing would be the right way of putting it, I think, is that particularly with the energy crisis that we're going through in Europe right now, increased OPEX of copper cable over fiber, because it's so much more hungry from an energy standpoint. This will probably become a driver as well for incumbent service providers, at least, to accelerate their migrations. But as I said, we're not seeing this just yet. All right, the last three that I want to talk about are around basically kind of a combination of awareness and availability. So availability creates awareness, right? So if you have fiber available to 70% of the population, a lot of people who were not aware of this a few years ago, even if they were in fiber coverage areas, become aware of it, and that creates a generic public awareness. But that can be reinforced by, you know, local and national governments in how they communicate about availability of infrastructure. There's a slightly ironic thing that I heard from a lot of players in various markets, which is that local governments go through a lot of effort to get service providers to connect the areas that they cover, where their citizens live. But once that's done, they rarely communicate about it. So there's an element here that's interesting. And of course, with awareness comes word of mouth. And when word of mouth is positive, which it very often is with fiber once installation is done, then that creates a strong driver on the market side. So this is really an overview. And as I said, the detailed view for each country is available in the full study that will be released today. But this is the conceptual framework that we have used. So from this, we also moved on to analyzing the few existing demand-side policies. As I said, there are not a lot, at least not in the sense of a strongly pushed and funded type of demand-side policies. Basically, there are two vouchers programs that we could identify at national level, one in Italy and one in Spain. Of course, there are other aspects like social tariffs, but these are much more spread about and very hard to assess the effectiveness of. We focused a lot of our analysis on the Italian scheme because, first of all, it was a lot more ambitious, and also the Spanish scheme is still underway, so there is no easy way to find analysis of the effectiveness. In the Italian schemes, end users were subsidized to either purchase new devices that could help them connect or to get a new subscription. Predominantly, users went for better devices, and this clearly did not drive adoption of better broadband solutions. The little impact that it had, which from memory is around 20% of beneficiaries went for the subscriptions. And when they did, they went for FTTC and not FTTH. So when we look at the amount of subsidies that was put on the table, this was a very limited impact. In fact, the program was put on hold in order to reassess both the allocation criteria and the subsidizing models. So there will be a new version of this program, which hopefully will be more effective. On the whole, the impression that we got from all market players was that the schemes were not effective and that there might be better ways to spend that public money to drive adoption. But we will have to assess the new versions of this when they come out. So some key conclusions from all of this. The the leading common thread is that when countries and or incumbents decided to focus on FTTC 10 years ago, or when cable has always been a very strong player in that market, then adoption lags behind for FTTH. This makes sense, but it also means that now that FTTC is coming to a certain degree to the end of its commercial life, it's harder to shift the customers over to the long-term solution that is FTTH. Another factor that we see in markets where wholesale is an important means to access the market for service providers is that the fragmentation of wholesale platforms is a hurdle. In other words, if you have 20 wholesale networks without a common denominator for service providers to serve all of them, it makes it very hard for the service providers to serve the market, and therefore it makes it very hard for adoption on these wholesale platforms to really increase. This is a very important issue. It's been solved in some markets, like France, for example. It's still a big issue in other markets like the UK, for example. Now, I mentioned that one of the hurdles was the physical connection itself and reluctance by consumers at the time of subscription. This is clearly an issue that we see to a larger or smaller extent in all markets. Again, some markets have sometimes preemptively addressed this, like Spain, for example, where, well, in multi-tenant buildings, vertical ducts have been built for fiber or any network, in fact, for the last 25 years, which means that this never really slowed down the deployment. In other markets like the UK, this is clearly an identified issue with you know, potentially strong consumer resistance to the actual installation. So, as I said earlier, we see that effective network competition has been a strong driver. Other models have been effective, but these more wholesale-oriented models, like we see in Sweden and Denmark, for example, require that strong national brands be available on fiber everywhere for them to be effective. So, to put it another way, predominant wholesale models without participation of the national brands creates a situation where take-up is damaged. And finally, this is kind of more of an overall view and kind of analysis of the entire scale of what we looked at. The impression that we got was that basically markets where the national plans for broadband were put in place early with strong conceptual choices that were clearly understandable by the market, these markets seem to be the ones that are the most successful when it comes to take up. So typically, you know, Spain and France, Sweden as well, Denmark to a large extent, from early on, it was quite clear where the market was going. This allowed market participants to invest with a degree of confidence, and it basically boosted both deployment and adoption. In other markets like Germany or Italy or the UK, where we see a lot of fluctuation in what the actual model is, that seems to hamper market development. So I wanted to spend a bit of time on the flip side of what policy can do, right? It is absolutely evident to us that policy can and should do a certain number of things to boost FTTH or in EU policy parlance, very high capacity network VHCN adoption. But we have also seen that some service providers are not doing a very good job at marketing their offers, at differentiating their pricing, their services, their features, their customer experience at the moment of installation might not be optimal. And those players that get all of these things right absolutely overperform the market. One clear example of this is, for example, Fibrous in the UK that has significantly higher take-ups than a lot of the other altnets. And that is because they understand what they're doing and they're executing on it, I think, in ways that are more effective than a lot of other players in the market. The other thing is that there is this friction between service providers and network operators when wholesale is the key access to market. And this friction, this hesitation from ISPs, et cetera, this is degrading the perceived value of fiber by the consumers. And this is an issue that very often the service providers have to address amongst themselves one way or another. This may be an area for policy to intervene when clearly the incumbent is kind of dragging its feet, but otherwise it's really something that the service providers themselves and the wholesale providers have to figure out. And finally, even though it's going away, there are still instances where service providers are reluctant to reinvest in consumers to get them over to fiber to the home. And that reluctance basically keeps the customer stuck on FTTC or other solutions. That's also clearly, in our view, a strategic error that is not for policy to address, but really for the service providers themselves. Now, as I said, policy has a role to play, and there are areas in which policy can and should make a difference. The first one, which I already discussed, is the switch off of PSTN and copper. This can only be fully implemented once VHTN adoption gets to 60–70%. So obviously not all countries in Europe and not even all countries in our sample, but it is a very important driver, and it's important to understand that this is also a key to a more sustainable telecom industry. We hear a lot about service providers saying that they need to be better at lower carbon footprint, et cetera. This will not happen without the copper network being switched off. So that's something that policymakers need to look into, even if the country is not at the stage where they can execute on this yet. The second thing is, even though the voucher schemes that we've looked at didn't seem to be very effective, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad idea, but it needs to be implemented better and targeted better. In particular, there is a paradox in in governments encouraging and quite often funding, either through European funds or national funds, the deployment of VHTN networks, and then not focusing their demand-side policies on adoption of VHTN networks. Why would I finance the deployment of fiber with one hand and then finance the adoption of anything with the other hand? These vouchers should be targeted at driving VHTN adoption, which incidentally is a European policy goal. So it's not just a nice to have. From a national regulator point of view, it is actually one of their 2030 goals. The other thing is that the subsidies are quite often focused on subscriptions or devices. But one of the things that came clear, particularly from the Italian case, is that maybe that same funding could be used to facilitate the migration in the same way that, for example, with DTT, schemes were put in place where people would go to meet older people who had low digital literacy, to help them through the process and basically make sure that the migration was smooth. This could very well be done in rural areas among pockets of elderly population, and might be a more effective way of using these same funds that currently go to voucher schemes. I already talked a lot about wholesale fragmentation. One thing that policymakers can do is to encourage national brands, maybe brands with significant market power, to participate in wholesale networks of a big enough scale. The other angle is for maybe government policymakers to get involved in facilitating adoption of industry standards that eliminate a lot of the practical and IT hurdles to serving wholesale networks. We talked about the advertising thing earlier, and clearly in some markets, the perception of what fiber is and the benefits that it delivers needs to be clarified because of the choices that were made on the advertising side. It won't be a massive impact ultimately, because if that fiber brand has been sullied, then that's not going to change now. But it is important then that local governments in particular be reactive when fiber gets deployed in their area to actually promote the benefits of fiber to their citizens. And that would be my last point. I think an area that is not necessarily costly or complex for governments to implement is simply to basically connect their supply side policy, the further deployment of fiber, with demand side clarity to say, well, this is not just because we want the infrastructure, it is because we think the citizens will benefit from it. And that message very often is missing. So that's kind of the overview of the study. Obviously, the full document that you will be able to access this afternoon has a lot more detail. But I hope I gave you a sense of where we got to. And I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you very much, Benoît. I think what you described is a relatively complex situation with many stakeholders involved, multiple angles we can use to look at that question, which remains nevertheless extremely important. And that is kind of reflected in the numerous questions we get from the audience. I think that report is more the beginning of a conversation with all stakeholders than the final point to this very important topic. So let me highlight some and relay some of the questions we received, and thanks everyone for sending this question on the app. So first question is, what about the availability of digital services which drive demand, for example, but not only Netflix or other content? What about the availability of content as part of the question we are addressing?
Well, as I mentioned, a lot of the content now is available to anyone who has a decent broadband service. So historically, certain providers had exclusive access to certain contents. So if you wanted Football League, you had to be with operator A or operator B. This is increasingly no longer true. So while the fact that there is more content online is a driver for broadband adoption, it is no longer a differentiator. The last point to be made maybe is that Netflix is actually very effective at delivering high quality video over a relatively limited amount of bandwidth. So even though content in general can absolutely drive adoption of better broadband, you can still experience very decent quality content without having fiber, and that means that it's going to be one of many drivers rather than the sole driver. Now, having said that, we did see, particularly during the various phases of lockdowns, that when you have 3 or 4 people within the home using Netflix at the same time to watch different things, that's when your FTTC connection is going to break down. So it does have an impact, not the only impact.
Yeah. I have a question concerning in-home connectivity, indoor connectivity solution. Question about, is it part of the equation? Is availability of, for example, high quality Wi-Fi, or the lack of availability of high quality Wi-Fi something hindering the development of fiber adoption?
Again, I wouldn't tie it specifically to fiber. What is clear is that from a customer point of view, from an end user point of view, most of them don't make a difference between the Wi-Fi, the internet, the fiber, the broadband. All of this is one and the same. Having low quality Wi-Fi with a high quality connection is something that the service provider might be aware is the issue, the customer might not. So in that sense, yes, it can be a hurdle, but it's not necessarily something that affects fiber only. It affects all solutions. Now, obviously, if you can tie as part of your offering, and this is what connects me back to differentiation, if you can tie, really good in-home connectivity solutions to your fiber product, then you will drive adoption of the fiber product. But the issue is not related to fiber directly.
Okay. I have another question which relates to the benefits of fiber in terms of lower carbon footprint compared to alternative access network technology, and how does the European target around our environment play into helping drive fiber adoption, basically?
Well, it absolutely needs to be aligned, right? There is no way that we get to a more sustainable industry without more fiber and less copper, and likely less cable, because cable is very energy hungry. Having said that, I don't think this is a consumer issue. In other words, it is for the service providers, and particularly the incumbent service providers, to realize that they need to accelerate fiber adoption for this to truly happen. And if they're not very good at marketing their own fiber services, then that's going to be slower than they intend. So we're kind of, as you said, it's a complex issue with multiple factors. But clearly, I thought that we would already hear people saying, we need to do this, we need to accelerate this, and maybe even governments saying, we need to impose some targets on energy consumption of network operators to accelerate this. It's not the case yet, and I think the reason is that the key driver is actually financial rather than green at this point in time. In other words, when it hurts financially, that's when things are going to accelerate. It so happens that it's going to be greener, but I sadly don't think that the primary motivation at this point in time is the kind of eco-consciousness angle.
I have a question which strangely came to us via email, related to the relative hurdle which are linked to the category of network that consumer needs to migrate from. In other words, is it easier to migrate a customer from copper to fiber than it is from HFC network to fiber? Have we measured that? Do we have any element to describe maybe the difference in those two scenarios?
Well, so we could be talking about two different things here. One which is the technical difficulty, and one which is from a marketing point of view.
It's more the question is more around marketing. How do you?
Okay.
Is it more difficult to convince someone currently being on a coax to migrate to fiber than it is to convince someone currently on legacy copper to move to fiber?
Theoretically, yes. In the same way that it's harder to get someone to come from FTTC to FTTH than it is to come from ADSL to FTTH. That would be the same kind of lever. That said, a lot of cable operators in Europe, for a variety of reasons, have relatively low customer confidence, customer trust. The brands, in other words, are often quite fragile. And when that is the case, then it's not a matter of performance. What is going to get the customer to migrate to another solution is just the fact that he's going to have another provider. So I think there is a marketing angle to play on the weakness of certain cable brands in certain markets. But that means that you need to deliver a better product and at a cheaper price anyway. So it's a reinforcement of product differentiation. It's not enough on its own. And also you need to have a brand that's perceived as, better, more positive, etc.
I have a question related to one of the points you mentioned, and this is what about the price gap between FTTH and cable? Because the person mentioned that you refer to price gap between copper and fiber. Does the same point apply to the price difference between cable and coax cable and fiber?
Well, then we get into a specific difficulty of pricing comparisons, which is that cable still to this day is usually packaged with a lot of content. Telecom operators increasingly either don't include a lot of content or do it in a way that's very cheap and is more like repackaging national, terrestrial channels and stuff like that. So it's hard to compare the prices, but we see in other markets where this price gap is higher, that if cable keeps on packaging a lot of content, it's very hard for them to get to a price point where they are actually competing with FTTH. Now, if you're in the FTTH market and you're offering something that's more expensive than cable, I would immediately say that that's probably not the right strategy. But my point is, if we're looking at cable as being broadband plus TV and compare that to FTTH as being broadband, it's not a valid comparison basis. But as I said, as ownership of content and exclusivity of content becomes less and less of a relevant issue, that's going to make it harder and harder for cable to compete on that basis. And we do see actually some cable operators like Virgin in the UK, and I think Ziggo in the Netherlands as well, that are increasingly going broadband only so that they can compete with broadband only on the other side.
Okay. I've got still quite a lot of questions. I will not be able to address all of them. Try to bundle 3 of them, which are related to the relation between overbuilt and tech up. Have we seen a negative or positive correlation between the level of overbuilt and the adoption of fiber?
Okay, so this is actually a data issue, which means that I can't conclusively give an answer to this. Even at a regulator level, there is very little data on overbuilding that is publicly available. So in markets like Spain and France, for example, you do not know exactly who connects how many homes and how many of those are competing with other homes. So this makes it hard to analyze this in a rational way. There is like anecdotal evidence that network competition drives adoption, but that doesn't mean that overbuild in itself is the primary factor. There's also a very real question of, is the third overbuilder still benefiting from an impact or does have a positive impact, or is it only the second one? I don't know. I can't answer these questions, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, I think, Benoît, we're getting towards the end of the session. I know many of you on the call probably have a hard stop at the top of the hour moving to another meeting, so I don't want to delay anyone. As I said, we will go through the unanswered question and probably go back to those who send these remarks. As you say, the full report, or maybe probably a way to cover most of the questions which went to us, and is now available on our website. It will also be shared with the thank you email, which will be sent to all participants. The FTTH Council is providing you with more than just this report. There are many elements from a technology and market standpoint you can find on our website. We also encourage you to join us in Madrid for the FTTH conference, where a session will be dedicated to this topic. And actually, it's likely to be a point raised in multiple panel and workshop at the conference. So with that, I would like to thank again Benoît for his hard work on this report, for this presentation today, for answering with a lot of knowledge to all questions. And I would like to thank our audience. You've been very consistent throughout the 1 hour, so showing your interest in the topic. So thanks again. Have a good rest of your day, and I would be very happy to see you on one of our future events. Thank you.
Thank you.